It comes and goes. We're out here chasing a feeling.
Good morning to you all. Welcome to Feels Out Loud, brought to you by Becoming Together Therapy and Wellness. It is Sunday, and I hope you have found your morning beverage and a cozy space to join us today. This is your host, Becky McNattin, along with my guest host today, Robin Melville. We are happy to have you listening as we live and share stories of mental health. Welcome, Robin.
Thank
you for being here today.
I'm excited.
You're a therapist with Becoming Together Therapy and Wellness, and it's exciting to have you joining the show today.
I am very excited to be here.
We're both therapists in outpatient mental health, and so much of what we work with is life transitions and the mental health impact of these. As humans, we have big emotions around change, and there are so many different types of transitions that we'll process through on the show over time. But for today, I wanted you and I to think about transition in employment and the kinds of change we might initiate ourselves, as well as the mental health impact of our job movement. And I found this quote recently that was really interesting to me to consider from this lens of professional transitions. The world hates change, yet it is the only thing that has brought us progress. The world hates change, yet it is the only thing that has brought us progress. And according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor in 2024, the average adult, Robin, holds 12 different jobs during their working life. 12 different jobs. And the research shows adults will have between 3 and 7 different careers in that time as well. It's a lot of change.
Wow. Yeah.
A lot of change.
7.
Yeah. And you fall into this category of adults because you're a therapist after having roles in other professional fields. So you're like a living embodiment of this concept. What do you think about the world hates change or human aversion to change in connection to our professional selves?
Well, first and foremost, I'd say, like, through my experience, I completely believe that. I think people are pretty opposed to change. It's pretty scary.
Mm-hmm.
I love the ending of that quote because it's a reminder of things have to change if we want to move forward, if we want to progress.
Mm-hmm.
On a larger scale and in our lives personally.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of times we hear people say, I'm not looking forward to Monday, or thank God it's Friday. And, just kind of a general not liking where they're at, but also a fear of taking the leap and making the change.
Well, you say that beautifully. It makes me think about, do we hate change? That first part of the quote, the world hates change. Do we hate it because the connections, the emotions connected to it are so hard?
Yeah. I mean, I have nothing more to say than, I think it's scary.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's our natural tendency to want to keep things the way they are, and stay in a place of safety.
Mm-hmm.
It's, kind of innate to us as humans of wanting to keep status quo and at the same time being so uncomfortable in that.
Mm-hmm. Like even, I think I've heard of it as kind of the what I know is better than the what I don't know.
Right.
Even if what I know I don't really like.
Right. It's like a familiar discomfort is better than anything unknown.
Mm-hmm. And you highlight when you said the last part of that quote is it is the only thing that has brought progress. I think about that in the expansiveness of just ourselves, that really, if I think about my own life, even the times of change, sometimes where I've sought the change myself, it is what has expanded me as a human being. I'm assuming you agree.
Oh, yes. The first stat you shared about the 12 roles, I think I accomplished that pretty quickly in my career.
Okay, so you've had more than 12 jobs.
Yeah, I'm one of those try something out, and if I don't like it, job hopper, I think, which is getting to be more common now.
Yeah.
But yes, I completely agree. Like, each role gives you a new experience and adds a new perspective.
It totally does. And I'm on the opposite side of the other side of the average. I love this. We will continue to talk through professional transitions and how we all can honor the spectrum of feels connected to it when we come back from this brief commercial break. Thank you for listening to Feels Out Loud.
You gotta find your people, then you'll find yourself. You gotta find your people. Express yourself. Express yourself.
Welcome back, everyone. It Feels Out Loud, brought to you by Becoming Together Therapy and Wellness. I am Becky McNattin, along with guest host today, Robin Melville. Let's continue with emotions connected to job change. Okay, I got a big question for you, Robin. What is present in job transition?
Oh man. Excitement, first and foremost. Well, not necessarily foremost.
It's a big one.
Right. It's like you said, it's a change you're opting into. So hopefully there is that excitement piece. Sometimes it's a change you need to make that you don't necessarily want to do. So, I guess there can be, it depends on the change you're making for what's present. But I think excitement and fear, kind of two sides of a coin there, because you're entering something new, because you're entering something unknown.
Yeah, you mentioned that in our last segment. It's this vastness of all sorts of things. We have no idea what they are, but we know that they exist. So it's this kind of sea of murky. I was just talking with somebody this week about transition. I know a lot of people right now who are thinking about either job or career transitions. And you mentioned excitement. When we have multiple feels at the same time, it's clunky. And transition feels really clunky. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I would say it's almost hard to separate and identify all the feels that are going on. Just naming, sure, you can be scared and you can be excited. Like, both of those can exist at the same time. You can be sad for what you might be leaving because it served you in some way. You can also be happy with where you're headed. Like, we often think it's one or the other, but it's more about the duality of those seemingly opposing feelings, and you can have all of them kind of going on at once as you're making this change.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That I think us as humans, we maybe see that we need to resolve a feel in order to make a decision about something. And you said, there might be sadness about what we're leaving, that maybe we story that in our minds of, I need to wait till I don't feel sad and I'm only excited in order to make a change.
Yeah, I think that can be one of the biggest pieces that prohibits people from moving forward to make the change. Is like, oh, I'm sad for leaving this. It must not be the right thing. I must want to stay. That can be true of relationships, of jobs, of really, where you live. Like, there can be sadness for something ending, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't be ending.
That it shouldn't happen. Yeah. Well, you mentioned sadness that it's ending. Almost like leaving a job can be kind of like a breakup. And as you think about your own experiences or clients you've worked with, friends in your life, what role does grief have in that transition? And what has it had for you?
Yeah. So, more context for our listeners. I transitioned from marketing and advertising into the world of therapy.
Big change.
Yeah, quite a kind of 180.
That's the 3 to 7 career shifts.
Yeah.
It's like, that's a totally different, although I'm sure you found some of the similar personality type or characteristics, things that you enjoy are present in both, but that's a really different, it's a different thing.
It's kind of like the same principles, but in a very different way, looking at them. So, grief with that was a lot of not only leaving. I was at a place that I really loved, and I really loved the owners, and I had a great experience there. And I recognized it was just time for me to move on. And there was a grieving process for leaving the team, leaving the people, leaving the future of what that role could hold for me.
You mean like capacity to move up? Or
Right.
Okay.
Like that growth path that we all kind of look for in our careers. It's kind of, you're stepping off of it.
Yeah.
And going back to the start. of a different one.
Yeah.
So there's, grief in that. And then also the identity of like, who am I without this role? You don't realize how much of a identity component our careers can be until you
Huge.
lose it.
Yes. And it sounds like in that moment you were sitting with, okay, I love how you bring up identity. Okay, I'm maybe shifting part of how I've identified myself, but I'm also getting tugged and exploring a different part of identity. Is that what you felt at the time?
Yeah, it was like, there are pieces here that I'm going to take with me. Of course, I'm going to take the experience, and it didn't feel like I left behind everything and started from scratch. It was more like, what of the identity pieces, parts of me that have developed in the advertising world, in this role, what of those will be beneficial and will I carry forward into my next?
Right. Almost like a repurposing, like an upcycling.
Yeah.
Because you had to go back to school too.
Yep.
You're laughing like, and people in your world maybe were like, are you knowing that you got to go back to school? Because part of the exploration of new aspects of identity, and sometimes this career shift, is you got to go get some more education.
And that is another thing that I think adds to the level of how scary it can be. I mean, it can be a pretty big mountain to climb. And so it's really dependent on like determining what you feel is worth doing to make it happen.
So I love the context there. I want to go back to when we're considering leaving a job. We're in that space of we're noticing something in ourselves. What might be the mental health impact at that point? What are we feeling? You've been there, obviously, so you can hearken to your own story. But maybe a life moment activates the need for change. I just want to go back to, for the people who might be listening to us today, who might be sitting in that space of in the before, in that moment before. Talk to me about that.
Honestly, to me, that was the hardest spot. The internal struggle that you feel, because you can sense this questioning you have. And it's whether or not, like, do I listen to this? How serious is this? It's almost like you mentioned earlier, in job change is like a breakup. This is also like kind of a relationship breakup, when you look at someone and think like, is this what I want? So you get to that point of, it starts internally first before anything starts happening in your outside world, of just that questioning. And that can be a long process. That can be weeks, months. It could even be years of sitting and assessing and analyzing and, trying to figure out like, well, if I don't want this, what do I want? And you might not have that answer yet. And so it really can be a lot of inner turmoil that you deal with.
Yeah. Well, and that sense of sometimes a life moment really gives us perspective on ourselves. And it can be awesome life moments. Like we meet a person who all of a sudden is really inspiring to us. I think about when I first realized that I could do poetry and therapy at the same time. I thought I understood. I've been doing outpatient mental health for a really long time, and I thought I knew all of what that was. And then I literally meet, who is a mentor of mine, meet a person who has done poetry work for decades. And so I all of a sudden looked at what I do totally differently. And I have to think that that's part of what maybe plants a seed in us of questioning, like, is this for me? You mentioned it starts as a wonder, and maybe it becomes sort of a repetitive wonder.
Yeah, like a bit of curiosity, I would say. Like I'm always kind of like looking around and wondering about things around me. And so the curiosity just comes with sometimes too much wonder about things around me. But like you said, it's the repetitiveness. It's the ones that continuously come back. It's like you almost try to ignore it and can't because it keeps happening.
Yeah, and I've met several people who they maybe it comes from a space of inspiration. They get inspired by volunteering somewhere, or they get inspired by attending a conference or even reading a book. And then they say to themselves, oh my gosh, this aligns with me, or this is like who I am. And has that happened for you?
It has. It's funny. I was just thinking about that as we were talking about this. A lot of the client work that I was doing at the agency was for nonprofits. The agency I was at was
When you were in advertising?
yes.
Okay.
Sorry. Specifically focused on, they were a benefit corporation. So like an ad agency with the take that they wanted to do good.
Okay.
And so a lot of helping nonprofits get their cause out there. And I ended up, there was a nonprofit that came to us for work. I ended up volunteering with them one weekend at a camp for children and families who are experiencing grief.
Okay.
And then just with my personal experience with grief, I was like, wow, this feels really fulfilling. And
this intersection of worlds.
right. It's like it was almost like I could spend my time doing this more. And then that's what kind of started the question.
Yeah. And maybe asking yourself, what would that even look like to do that more?
Yeah.
Like sometimes when we are, you bring up the feeling of excitement, but sometimes when we're excited, it challenges us to ask the questions of what would it entail? You probably didn't know in the beginning when you're initially kind of intrigued by this that it involved going back to school.
Yeah, that part I was like, shoot. But
okay, sure. Sure.
Yeah, I had thought about it and asked like a couple people I knew that were either they were in the realm of psychology and therapy. I learned all about licensure, and I was like, okay, so this would be a big commitment. And finding that information out, I think, was huge to also make sure you have that before you make the change, before you start to.
Yeah, well, that's a really awesome takeaway from this discussion on, so you knew people who were already therapists that you could ask some questions to, but this thought of when you notice in yourself the questioning, go get some information.
Absolutely.
And we are huge believers in this idea of connection and relationship. What would you say if people didn't know somebody? What would they do?
Google. No.
Well, maybe.
But yeah, honestly, like I just, start reading about it, start looking for information on it, and depending on what the role or career is, start kind of trying to interact with it in some way, shape, or form. Like working it into your life or getting exposed to it in some way to help you either gauge whether you want and feel that energy as you continue, or if it's like, oh no, this was an interest, but I see what goes into it and it's not for me.
Yeah. Well, it was initially when I way younger in my lifetime, I was very interested in music and vocal performance, and I thought that's what I wanted to do, and did some research on it and realized I only wanted that as a hobby. I did not want to do that as a career. So I like your thought process there of, if we're initially intrigued, like honor that part of you.
Yeah.
So be curious and honor your wonder. Go do something about that. Take some action in volunteering for a thing. It sounds like it sort of landed in your lap.
Oh, yeah, it did. It was like, oh wow, it felt like kind of a message of like, this is the direction that I need to go next.
Yes.
But I do like that you said like, just start, and you can start small. Like I think one of the biggest things about the change is like, it can look so huge, but just finding like the tiniest ways to introduce yourself to it, knowing that there's no pressure to fully commit.
Right.
You're not like leaving where you're at. You're not like, I did this kind of information gathering before enrolling in school, like before you take those larger steps, start with like little bite-size interactions with it.
Well, and you mentioned looking it up on the internet. It is one of the like coolest things that we have available to us now in terms of resource, that we can do pretty easy research on something. What we see a lot as therapists is people who are sitting in that spot of questioning. And my guess is you've heard this many times as a clinician, Robin. How do I know if I'm making the right choice? How do I know if I'm making the right decision? And I'm going to leap forward a little bit in what the inner dialogue might be for somebody, but I want to know if I'm going to hate what I picked later. And I want to know it right now. And you talk about starting small, but to me, those two concepts are so aligned. It can be really scary to take action because we wonder if we're going to hate what we do or regret it, or, I don't know, feel like it was a waste of time, judge ourselves, all sorts of things. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I want to acknowledge like that is like a huge component, especially if it involves a financial investment, like going back to school.
Sometimes big financial investment could be starting a business.
Right.
It could be years of work as you went to school for a couple years.
Yeah, I mean it's a leap of faith for sure. So of course, asking yourself, is this the right decision? We talk about finding information, and you want to explore that in some capacity. My short answer to that question, though, is like, you can't know before you try, right? Like you can't.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, we can't get that answer. And what I would say to my clients if they asked is, will you feel better about having made the decision and getting the answer regardless of what it is? Or will you feel better staying where you're at and always wondering?
Yeah, well, it's that you highlight safety and security and versus risk, and what will resonate for you more, staying where you're at and wondering, or seeking some information and then maybe finding out it didn't ring.
Yeah.
I wonder what, because your switch in careers is a lot to do with, I'm imagining a value system, a value shift, maybe just even a recognition of values. I do think that can connect to, hey, I want to know if I'm making a mistake later on, and I'm going to find that later on. To me, there is an option of, in this moment right now, we can sit with, well, what do I believe? What do I value?
Definitely.
And is this path, like, is what I'm looking at, does that align with that? What do you think?
I think that's a huge piece to highlight too, is like, well, let's look at where we're at right now. And sometimes getting too caught up in the outcome or the end game can cause us to be kind of in an analysis paralysis. So I think the question
analysis paralysis. It's like my everyday.
Yeah,
yes,
it's a thing.
Yes.
But the values piece is huge, because it's like, how do you feel about what you're doing? How do you feel about the company you're at?
Yeah.
How do you, what matters to you in life? What do you want your life to look like? What do you want your day-to-day to be? If you're at a role where, you're making the salary you want, but you aren't enjoying yourself until Saturday, is that worth it? For some people it is, and for some people it's not.
Yeah.
So it's really a matter of reflecting on, what do I value? What do I want out of life? And how can I find something that I can do that aligns with this?
Yeah, because definitely for some people, what they value is things that their position or job might allow them to be able to do.
Yeah.
It's things outside of their employment. And for some people, they want to find meaning in that doing. And we're in a space and time in society where I think all sorts of people are sitting with, well, what do I believe right now? How do I reckon with what I believe? And how can that be highlighted in how I'm living my life?
Yeah, like what I'm doing, what I'm working towards. How can I feel good about that? And what do I need to make that happen?
And you talk about the job that you had before you became a therapist, and I didn't meet you till you already were a therapist, but the job you had before you became a therapist, you loved. So what was it like then to sit with values of, well, I love this thing and this is great. And
Yeah, that was the struggle that I had sat with internally for a while, was just, okay, looking at the things that I liked about it and being creative. And I don't know if anyone knows much about ad agencies. They are a fun place to work. They're challenging at times, but they're fun.
mm-hmm,
And that's hard to leave when you have those aspects that,
mm-hmm,
especially my younger self, that's what I pictured for
mm-hmm.
my role. Like,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, I'm going to be one of those cool advertising people.
Yeah.
But that is, it's that questioning, it's that inner voice, it's that pull that you start to weigh the pros and cons, and ultimately have to decide. That's where I think priorities and values come into play hugely, is because I realized the feeling I was getting with helping people, that was a huge part of the role that I had that I
Got it.
enjoyed.
Yeah.
And so it's like, how can I get more of that and less of, the components that I wasn't really passionate about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because doing that job, you are helping people do their work. You're helping highlight the coolest aspects of businesses to the people. So I can absolutely see how then from that you would almost kind of split that into different categories and say, but what about helping people
Right.
do I really
Right.
enjoy? Which part of helping people? Do I like helping people be able to help people? Do I want to do the doing of that myself?
Right.
And so interesting that the world kind of hands you this gift of working specifically with an organization that then just like resonated with you personally, and you're doing that job in advertising and allows you to say, oh my goodness, I wonder what it would be like to do this work,
Right.
not just help them do the work.
Yeah. Yeah. And the cool part, when I look back, I can see kind of how these pieces align. The agency itself, I was drawn to because of their values of helping small businesses, nonprofits, causal marketing, so marketing for important causes.
Got it.
That's what drew me to that specific ad agency.
Mm.
So it was already kind of aligning with values, and then it just kind of took off from there. So it was a really cool, I don't know, avenue to kind of start that process.
Yeah. And a few minutes ago, you talked about professional transitions really as identity transitions.
Mm-hmm.
That so much of what we do is how we see ourselves. And so what we do it is also a mental health impact in our life, like changing that sense of identity. How did you navigate that? And how do you help people navigate that?
Yeah. Let me think about my I'll think about me first.
Mm-hmm.
I think with going to school, that was a helpful, I don't know, it made the shift a little more gradual than abrupt. I think for those who are making a career change very abruptly, that would be incredibly difficult. Not that it's not difficult in the gradual sense, but just kind of starting to notice who you are in each of the places. So like, who am I when I walk into this ad agency, and then who do I feel like I am when I'm going to my internship as a therapist, right? And
Yeah.
down to the outfits I would wear. It's like, it's different pieces of you that start to show up
Yeah.
when you find yourself in those different environments.
Yeah.
And so
Sure.
there's the grief component too, of like, are these pieces of me lost if I leave this role? And yeah, that one's tough. And so helping others through that, I think, is just noticing what is new that's coming up, and then what do you miss, and what do you want to bring with you, and what are you okay with leaving and knowing it served you, but it no longer does.
For sure. Yeah. And you mentioned that you deliberately stepped into new identity or an old identity of learner, student, where you're supposed to be the question asker, or and how that might be different if you were moving from job to a job without school in between.
Yes.
And I love how you say, though, this, okay, well, which parts of identity, like, think through it. Which parts of identity do you want to take with you that you've been shaped in these beautiful ways through the work that you've done? And what parts of you or identity do you want to leave where you're leaving?
Right. Like what was helpful here that won't necessarily be helpful in my next role.
Yeah. And you talk about when we jump into the role of learner, I'm going to highlight an aspect of this that my guests, people who are sitting at home who are wondering about the tug of job transition, imposter syndrome, and the role that plays in both fear of the unknown, also perhaps a rationalization of like why we shouldn't make the change.
Right.
Because sometimes we're moving from a spot where we feel a strong sense of security in what we do. And I'm not necessarily saying security of having the job. I'm saying security of the identity that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
And knowing that we're moving into a spot where we don't know stuff. So first, what role do you think imposter syndrome plays in job transition?
I think you got to be ready to have imposter syndrome come along with you in job transition. It's really challenging and can make you question whether or not, like that question we talked about, am I doing the right thing?
Yeah.
I think that's imposter syndrome is the one that you're carrying that's saying, no, you're not. That doesn't make it right. It doesn't mean that you aren't doing the right thing. I think it's natural to feel imposter syndrome when you are trying something new. And when you're making a change, it's a weird, like you start to feel it in both places because you no longer fit in one.
That's a good point.
But it's before you fully feel like you fit in the other.
Yeah. Like 1 foot out, 1 foot in.
Yeah. And so you're not really fully in either place.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where a lot of the wonder of, who am I becoming? The identity piece, the questioning is like, especially when you're towards the end of the transition and you have a day where you're like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And I left a place where I knew exactly what I was doing.
Yeah.
That's a really difficult day. And I've had that day several times.
Because you're talking about settled, feeling settled, grounded in what we know.
Yeah.
And we spend a long time coming up with that.
Oh, yeah.
We spend a long time coming up with that. And imposter syndrome is innately a questioning of, do I have the skills and abilities to do this thing?
Mm-hmm.
And really a ruminative thought about, do I have the skills and abilities? And sometimes even an answering of, no, I don't.
Right.
But I need to pretend like I do.
Yeah. And you won't right away.
And you won't. You won't. And I hear you saying, and yet it doesn't mean we don't do.
Right.
And as soon as we have nurtured wonder enough to say, I think I might want something else in my life, we already then have created the murkiness of where we are. Because you're saying then there's some, I don't quite fit in here now because I've literally had to wonder about being somewhere else.
Yeah. Like my mind has already gone there. So there's really no taking that back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you're talking about, as we have had this conversation in the last half hour or so, I'm thinking about a image of like a town hall meeting where all of our feels gather together. And you seem to have done this amazing job at listening to the town hall, because
it's loud.
Well, because when we think about feels present in any transition, but let's be exclusive to just job transition right now. You talked about fear.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned sadness. You mentioned the word curiosity, I don't know, a few minutes ago. I'm thinking about confidence
Oh,
and how
sure.
shaken that is.
Yep.
That's part of imposter syndrome, being present in I don't know what I know anymore. And maybe I know what I don't know,
Oh, yeah.
which is real
Very
scary.
aware of that.
You mentioned excitement and you didn't say hope, but to me there's this aspect of hope
Definitely.
that comes with one excited wonder.
Right. Like that's really behind what you're making the change for, right? Like you don't make a change without a sense of hope, I would think.
Hmm. Uh, and and it's part of what allows us to say, well, I kind of get what the story would be where I'm headed. You talked about maybe upper movement. You maybe talked about, I know what my role could be. I know what the options might be. Hope is this like we're not sure.
Yeah.
We're not sure, but it feels, what does hope feel like to you? It feels like fill in the blank.
Um Hope feels like a warm blanket. I don't know.
Mm.
That visual came to my mind. It's
Hmm.
kind of like that feeling that I think that's actually what gives you the strength and confidence to move forward despite all the other things, despite the imposter syndrome and the questioning and the fear.
Hmm.
It's the hope that um, has been the main motivator.
Well, I love that. I was thinking about who else might be present if these feels are at this town hall. Certainly guilt. I have heard so many people talk about, and I wonder what Hope would say to guilt. I've heard so many people talk about, I know what and who I'm leaving.
Yes.
I know what I'm maybe like slamming my coworkers with,
Right.
or I know what I do there, and I know what they will now have to do. So guilt is this huge component, and wondering about rejection in what am I not going to know what to do? Who is not going to hire me if I'm thinking about leaving? What would you say about those two?
The guilt piece definitely is a tough one, especially if you keep in touch with the people and the people you left behind.
Yeah.
Let's say, because you see that they are still in it. Um, I think something that helped me personally with that is recognizing that I can have empathy for their struggles and their challenges. It doesn't necessarily make me responsible for it.
Ah.
And it's kind of separating yourself from the idea that you need to save everyone else there.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
That you can hold the hardship
right.
and still take action.
Right.
Yeah, well, it's when I was thinking about just a few minutes ago, you talked about seeking community, not doing this alone. That change doesn't happen alone. That maybe what we have to do is really say, okay, I'm going to be curious about. I'm going to give space to the guilt. I'm just gonna. It doesn't mean I don't take action about it, but I'll be curious about what the guilt says. Um, and even as we're thinking about the town hall of ourselves, that we are community. You mentioned reaching out to people who do the work to ask questions or
Yep.
doing research, but also that inside is this inner dialogue that is community.
Oh yeah.
And giving a hug to flexibility and adaptation around what that community is going to be saying at different moments in time. That none of those feels are driving the decision. They're literally just feels.
Right. They're in the back seat. You know, you're in the driver's seat. They're in the back seat, kind of shouting directions at you. You get to choose which one you listen to.
Yeah, the wonder. Just wonder and let yourself imagine what's next for you. Maybe even close your eyes. And whether or not you have a transition, letting yourself imagine about you is critical to your mental health. That the fact that you've even allowed that to occur and said, I do have this community of self that is going to have all sorts of feels about it that are going to weigh in and maybe aren't going to, like, in the end, make the choice. I still will make the choice.
Yeah. It can be scary.
Love it. So many things to think about here. After the commercial break, we're going to talk through listener questions on how to handle change and transitions in employment. Feels Out Loud will process your thoughts when we return. Thank you for listening.
Everybody needs help. Express yourself.
We are back again with Feels Out Loud, and this part of the show is where we talk through questions from you all, our listeners. If you have a question related to mental wellness, sharing feelings, or our topics for each week that you would like us to process through, please visit our website at becomingtogethermn.com and find the Feels Out Loud page to submit a question directly, or you can email us at contact@becomingtogethermn.com. We really do want to hear from you and what you are wondering about. And I want to say thank you to the listeners who have sent in questions about the topic of job change. Robin, this listener that we're going to answer the question for asks us a very crucial question.
All right.
I am thinking about changing careers and the people in my life are not being supportive. What should I do? And so to this listener who shared this question, well said. That's what I want to say. Well said. How often are we tugged in a direction in life that feels right for us and the people around us don't give support that we need? So I'm just going to say to you, listener, way to call out and name so beautifully an experience that many of us have had. And I want to say first, remember that humans in our nature all resist change. We talked about this in our last segment. So your question about others not supporting you has me thinking about whether the lack of support is about you, listener, or is it about the people in your life having their own feelings about the concept of change? Just ponder that for a second, that maybe the lack of support isn't about your change. It's that perhaps your change might result in change for them. Just because you have a lack of support doesn't mean you should not seek the change. And second, I'd challenge you to think about that, maybe even make a list about what support would look like and be very specific with this. Think through what you believe would be helpful, and then look at what you could specifically ask for from people, or what you might be able to even offer yourself. Like, for example, if you need positive reinforcement, maybe you create the messages for yourself and put these in spots that only you'd see. Robin, what do you think? What would you say to this listener?
I would say, I hear you, and I was there.
Yeah.
Been there.
Yeah.
Maybe a couple times. I don't know. I'm sure my parents would say there are quite a few times where I go a direction that they don't necessarily support.
Sure.
And let's acknowledge how difficult it is to be in that spot. It can be very isolating. It can feel incredibly lonely.
Very lonely.
You share your doubts and your ideas, and this new thing you're most likely excited about. It's really, really discouraging and disappointing when the people in your life don't join you in that.
Mm-hmm. It's really vulnerable to share what we might be dreaming about.
It is. And like Becky said, it doesn't mean that you should give up on it, or it doesn't mean that it's wrong. Sometimes only you can see the picture that others can't. Because they can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And it just, to me, it was kind of like, okay, that's fine. I will continue on and I will help you see it in the future. You haven't done the full processing of it that I have, because it takes you a long time to get to that point where you are making the change.
Yeah, well, and you bring up an interesting point in this, that it could be important to listen to the feedback that your people share with you. Like, have you thought about, have you wondered about? Sometimes they might be helping you consider logistics or protocol, but you said something that was so touching to me in they can't see it like you can.
Right.
And they don't necessarily know how you've tuned in to the conversation of you.
Yeah.
They're not part of that inner discussion. And you didn't say it out loud, but you reference that trust of self, that where you're headed is where you're headed.
Right. And you've done the work internally. Like, you've listened to all your feels, you've listened to the questions, you've gotten there, you've got to that point. So just help them get theirs.
Absolutely. Well, wow. We are at the end of our show today. Thank you for listening this morning. Join us next week as we talk about self-criticality. And in the week ahead, everyone, be kind to yourself. Remember that connection fosters wellness, and your voice is one the world around you needs to hear. Share yourselves, friends.
Feel just a little,